Good evening and welcome to AAA News. Our breaking story is what is happening in Libya as the Arab Spring goes on. With the importance of education and freedom at top priority, let's compare and contrast the Enlightenment era with the Arab Spring. Libya became part of the Arab Spring when Gaddafi ruled for 42 years and he made it illegal for political parties to disagree with him. He controlled the media and anyone else who disagreed with him was imprisoned or killed. The Libyans revolt because they believe in their cause, and like most protesters throughout the Arab Spring world, they consider life under the dictator no longer tolerable. The protest turned into a civil war, and how the protest started is still unclear. There was not an individual group or person that started the rioting. A lot of the protesters were untrained volunteers. With them being volunteers, a lot of the protests were chaotic and more deadly. Economic conditions are worse off than they were 2 years ago in Libya. FDI levels have fallen, GDP growth is down, and unemployment has increased. The General National Congress has power but has yet to form an interim government and draft the new Libyan constitution. Libya needs to outsource most state services and reduce the subsidies on fuel, food, electricity, and replace them with those who need them. A citizen of Libya says, Libya needs to reform the banking sector to free capital for business, and it needs to drastically improve the doing business environment of Libya. Since the war, oil production decreased, which is the main export of Libya. The hydrocarbon sector dominates the Libyan economy. In terms of domestic economy, the hydrocarbon sector represents 4/5 of GDP. It generates 95% of total physical revenue and 98% of export receipts in 2011 and 2012.
Before the Arab Spring took place, the people had very few rights. Women and non-Muslims could not testify in court. No one could form a political party or have an opposing view of Gaddafi's rule. Talking about politics with foreigners was punishable by up to 3 years in prison. The Libyan people were very restricted in what they could and couldn't do.
With the dictator taking away the citizens' rights, they are sick of not having the freedom they are supposed to have. When the war broke out, 18,000 detainees from 2011 are still in detention facilities. About 3,000 of these are in government custody. Most do not have access to lawyers of judicial reviews. Military and civil courts imposed at least 28 death sentences. The freedom of speech and press was taken away. There were many attacks and killings against journalists and many charges for writing what was on their minds. Attacks were made on religious sites with no effort to protect the sites of minorities or arrest those responsible for attacks. Libya's Supreme Court lifted restrictions on polygamy, letting a man marry up to 4 wives without the prior consent of a first wife. Rights were ignored and gone against. They elected a General National Congress, the GNC, to replace the National Transitional Council, which took over after the leader was overthrown. The GNC elected Mohamed Maghreb as president and de facto president of Libya in August 2012. and Ali Zidane as Prime Minister in mid-October. The GNC was to have a 60-member committee to draft a new constitution for Libya, following the approval by the GNC of a political isolation law in May 2013. Maghreb resigned as GNC president and was replaced by Nouri Absamen, the first Berber leader of Libya. The government of Libya now has their priorities announced in the 2013 plan and budget, such as restoring national security, promoting economic recovery, improving. Austin will explain the Enlightenment.
Before the American Revolution, but during the Enlightenment era, the colonies had a pretty good economy. The Parliament stayed out of business for the most part, and taxes were low. Taxes started to rise without the consent of the people in the 13 colonies or even a representative of theirs. The American Revolution was somewhat a part or a result of the Enlightenment era. In 1765, the Americans rejected the taxations from the Parliament authority because they did not have elected representation. In 1773, protests escalated, as in the Boston Tea Party. In 1774, the British imposed punitive laws. In 1775 is when open conflict started between Great Britain and the 13 American colonies. After the war ended in 1783, the 13 colonies won their independence, and shortly after, they constructed the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights gave Americans human rights similar to the rights that the people in Libya are trying to obtain during the Arab Spring. Those rights being freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom of education, and many more.
In Libya and during the French and American Revolution, they all threw over their leaders, made new constitutions, and were at one point very poor. Now we are going to cut over to an interview we got earlier this week to close out the segment. I am Amanda Riggs, and I'm here with
AR.
And we're going to talk about the Arab Spring. So AR, what is your opinion on the Arab Spring?
The Arab Spring, I believe it started out as something good. There was a lot of good reasons behind the Arab Spring. Some of them being justice and better economy, fighting oppression. So I believe that was a good thing, but at the same time, a lot of violence and a lot more harm, I believe, at least short term, has been done than good. Now for the long term, it might be better. But so I believe it's good and bad, and I can't really say in one word. Every country had their own circumstances. My dad's from Syria, so what they had was different than people in Egypt, for example. So, but again, the same idea.
So the country we're focusing on is Libya, and if you would have been in Libya when they revolted, would you have joined in? Why or why not?
I don't know the details about why Libyans kind of revolted, but I'm assuming it's pretty much across the board the same reason. Why would I join or not? I do not know. I mean, I would probably support it just because I know what you're standing for, but I wouldn't join in because I feel like it's just. I mean, number one, I would want to put myself in harm's way, and a lot of the people who actually did join under the revolution, they had to move to a different country. They had to change they couldn't let their identity be seen by others, especially the government, forever after, because they're under a threat because they actually were part of the people revolting. So ideally, I would be in support, but realistically, I probably wouldn't join.